We'll be reading out of Philippians 2:12-30. Therefore, my good friends, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purposes. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault as a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them in the stars in the sky, and you will hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the days of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and services coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoiced with all of you, so that you too should be glad and rejoice in me.
Well, we are very pleased to welcome you to the worship of God with the Delray Church as we are celebrating all that it means to be a family. I was wondering, how well do you know your family tree? Some people find a great interest in researching their ancestors. Most people probably know who their grandparents are. Some even know who their great-grandparents were, but if you get back 6 or 7 or 8 generations, a lot of times families have lost the record. Now, some people would say that their family tree is filled with fruits and nuts, or they might say that you're the fruit or the nut in the family tree. And there might even be branches in your family tree you would rather prune out than admit they were your family, but you don't get to choose who your family is and which you were born into. And so even if there are those members of the family you'd rather were not, that's not something you have a choice of. But you do have a choice of your spiritual family tree. You have a choice to follow Jesus. You have a choice to be a part of the church. And I wonder, who is part of your spiritual family tree? Who was it that taught you about Jesus? Who was it that helped you come to a faith? Wouldn't it be interesting if we could know who baptized who all the way back to the day of Pentecost? Because you think about that. Somebody baptized me, and someone baptized that person, and someone baptized that person. There would be a chain all the way back, reaching through history, all the way back to the day of Pentecost. And perhaps that's one of the things we'll know when we are in heaven. What is the whole chain? What is the family tree? So not only who has contributed to my spiritual growth, but then the family tree continues. Whose growth are you contributing to? As we've said, the life in the North River Valley has changed quite a lot in the last 125 years. We think about what it would have been like for the church when it was first built in 1896, what it would have been like for all of the different things that have happened over the years. But what we think about is that people invested themselves, or this church wouldn't be here. If they'd have wanted to quit, there's all kinds of reasons they could have quit. There's all kinds of challenges in this world. So today, when we think about how overwhelming and noisy life can be, let's remember, these people who went before us faced challenges too. They faced epidemics where people died. They faced world wars. They faced all kinds of challenges, deep snows and flood and all kinds of special challenges. Like them, we find our peace in the storm when we realize that even though the storm is going on around us, God is still in control. He's still moving us along in the journey. So our sermon series for September and October is coming from the book of Philippians, and I would hope that you would read all of it to get all of the context of everything that we're saying. The book of Philippians teaches us how that we can have peace, even in the midst of challenges. The church was born in the middle of a storm. The church has survived many different storms. And even now, if your life is in the midst of a storm, whether it's a health crisis or a family crisis, or just you're concerned about what's going on in the world all around you, we still have peace, knowing that over the years and over the centuries, God has proven his care for his people. And even in the midst of the storm, we can shine like stars. That's what the Apostle Paul wrote. So today we're going to talk about briefly, how do we shine like stars? And we're going to see 4 things that I'm going to draw out, but if you read the whole passage, you'll probably find other things yourself. We're going to talk about continuing, that this is a process, that God is at work. It's not instantaneous. That we are called to do everything, that we're called to be people of action, not just talk. That we prove ourselves by how we survive the challenges of life and how we continue to serve others, and then to honor others, that it is appropriate that we take time and honor those who have gone before us. Remember, when Paul wrote this letter, he was writing to the people at Philippi. And if you remember from Acts chapter 16 and other places in the Bible, the church in Philippi was born in a rather dramatic fashion. Remember, Paul and Silas were traveling as missionaries around the Mediterranean, and they came to this town of Philippi, which was an important town. And as they were preaching and teaching, they encountered a demon-possessed slave girl who was harassing and heckling them. And so they cast the demon out of her. Well, that made her masters angry, and they got a group together and beat up Paul and Silas, had them put in jail, which was in the inner area of the jail, the worst of the worst. At midnight that night, Paul and Silas were praising God and singing hymns. The other prisoners were listening to them, even in the midst of pitch darkness. And an earthquake suddenly made everyone's chains came off. The doors all opened. The jailer was ready to kill himself because he knew the death penalty if he let a prisoner escape. But instead, Paul said, "No, we're all here." And the jailer came in and knelt before Paul and said, "What do I have to do to be saved?" And Paul and Silas spoke to his family, and that night he and his family were baptized. And others in the town and the area were baptized. And so the church began in the midst of all of these challenges. So now, at the time of this writing, Paul has gone on, he's moved on, and he is in prison in Rome. He's awaiting his trial, where he will either be set free or executed. But he's writing to the church to encourage it. And his words continue to encourage us today, that we should shine like stars. So Paul writes to them and says, continue. Let God continue his work in you. Continue to work out your salvation. Continue to allow God to work in you, that we can shine like stars. You see, in every generation, men and women face challenges. And if you want to quit, you want to give up, you have plenty of excuses. But Paul was writing to them and urging them not to give up, but to continue. Think about how this church and the history of this church has continued from decade to decade to decade. And that the transitions have to be made, and that those who are children grow up to be leaders. And those who are leaders have children and grandchildren who will be the next generations. We think about, it's not always easy to shine like stars in the midst of the darkness. The Bible is filled with examples of those who continued, even in the face of opposition. On Sunday evenings, we've been studying about the life of Noah and some lessons we can take from his story, and how Noah continued to be faithful to God, to listen to God, to preach about God, even when everybody else turned away. He was an example for us that we continue without giving up. He said, allow God to fulfill his good purpose. What a great thought that is. That God has a purpose for your life. He has a purpose for my life. He has a purpose for this church. That we are not just randomly getting together, But God created you, redeemed you, empowered you, and now He has a purpose for your life. Your life matters. My life matters. This church, it matters because God has a purpose. And the more closely we are aligned to His purpose, the more fulfilling we are feeling and the more peace we will experience. Paul writes to the church and says, do everything. He's talking about being people of action. Not just people who talk or pray about it or think about it or discuss it, but what are you going to do? Paul says, do everything. He says, be people of action. Think about the people who make this life of ours in this community run. It takes all kinds of different people doing all kinds of different jobs to build up the community and ultimately to contribute their efforts to the church. But this valley was not built by people who laid around and waited for someone else to do the work. This church was not built by people who sat around and said, well, somebody else will do it. It was built by people who took responsibility and were active. Think about when the settlers came to this valley. It was filled with trees. Everyone in the family had to work together. There were trees to be cut down, animals to be cared for, cabins to be built, food to be cooked. Every single person had a job to do. These were not people who sat around and said, well, now we're here, who's going to take care of us? There was no one else to take care of them. They took care of themselves. Through difficulty and challenges, they took care of themselves. Everyone contributed to the work of the family. And in the church, every member of the body is important. Every part is important. Now you know that your body, if 50% of the members of your body didn't work, your life would not be very fulfilling. It takes every member of every part of your body working for you to get up in the morning. And in the church, every single person is important. Every single one has something to contribute. There are no spiritual giftings of just sitting in the pew and watching others do the work. Everyone has something to contribute. In fact, Jesus said to His disciples in John 13, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. The church was not built because people knew what to do, or even prayed about what to do, or even talked about what to do. The church then and the church now is built up because people do the work. They get involved. Paul says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. Now, who would have imagined that churches would grumble and argue with each other? Well, one of the things that's been interesting as I've been kind of doing some research on the history of the church has been one of the diaries of one of the members was shared, some of the excerpts. So this is from the diary of Lily Lee, who is the grandmother to several people in this congregation. This is from 1954. January, it says, the weather was cold and cloudy. We went to church. There were 78 out for Sunday school. Now think about that. Today, if there's 3 snowflakes, people say, I better stay home. 1954, it was cold and cloudy, and 78 people came to Sunday school. But did you see the second paragraph? There was a hot argument among the high officials today. They let the devil overrule in church today. Now, I don't know what they were fighting about. It's probably been forgotten. But it's just to say that 70 years ago, there were arguments in the church about what to do. And even today, people have disagreements, and that'll be the way it is. As long as you put 2 people in the room, eventually there'll be one argument. So, we have to choose to work together. We live in a world that is bitterly divided about things like politics and economics and ideas. But what about the church? Are we going to be divided, or are we going to be a uniting factor? Are we going to be the source of peace or the source of irritation? Paul calls on the people to be blameless and pure, the children of God. And that is to what we aspire. We can't change everyone around us, but we can make a choice that we are blameless and pure and acting as children of God who honor our Heavenly Father. Romans chapter 15, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Rome, "We who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Each of us should please our neighbors for their good, to build them up." That's the spirit of the people who lived in this North River Valley at one time, that they watched out for each other, took care of each other, and helped each other out. That ought to be the spirit that characterizes our church as well. And then Paul goes on in Philippians 2, and he's talking about some of the people that he's worked with. And one of them was Timothy. And he talked about how Timothy had proved himself over time. It was not that Timothy had just gone to school or that Timothy had a lot of money, but he had proved himself through challenges and difficulties that he was concerned about the church and helping the church and serving the church. And that's the way it is for us, that we prove ourselves, not by the amount of money in our bank account or the amount of education we've had or any of that. Those are all useful resources. But it's when we actually serve the church, even in times of challenges, that we prove ourselves. Jesus said to his disciples, "This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." This church exists as the fruit of someone else's labor. Your faith and my faith exists because somebody bore fruit in our lives, invested themselves in our lives, and now we can do that for others. Paul goes on to talk about a man named Epaphroditus, who was the messenger who had brought an offering and money from the church at Philippi to Rome, where he was in jail. And he said that we need to honor those who are faithful servants. We need to acknowledge them, not in a prideful way to build them up or to in any way replace the honor of Christ, but just to say people who do a good work deserve to be honored. People who have done things for you in your life deserve to hear you say thank you, to acknowledge what they've done. We don't have a chance to thank those who have gone on before us. You know, this is Jim Davis, the guy who donated the land and helped build the first church building. The Pattersons, they're not around anymore, but they were some of the early ministers. But we honor them by at least acknowledging their names when we know it. We acknowledge them by remembering what they've done. And we acknowledge them by serving with the same spirit that they gave us. You know, the greatest blessings in our lives are the connections that we have. The connections you have in your natural family. The connections we share in this community. But most of all, the connections that we have in the church. Those connections are special because those are eternal connections. The people that we sing praises with today are the people we will be singing praises to God with in eternity. We have a great blessing for which we should be very thankful and appreciative. So how do we shine like stars? Just briefly looking at Philippians chapter 2, we've seen that you continue. You realize it's a process. It's not an instant thing. It's not a microwave. It's more of you do it generation to generation. That we are people who do. We don't just talk. We don't just pray. We don't just think. We do. We put our faith into action. We prove ourselves, not just when times are easy, but when times are difficult. And because of that, we stop and we honor others as well. It's important that we say thank you. It's important that we acknowledge them. It's important that we say your work mattered. And we look forward to the day when someone else remembers us and looks at us and says, your life mattered. The Delray Church exists to help people connect with God and with each other in every generation. That's why it was formed, and that's why we continue today. Not for our own glory or for our own attention, but that we point people towards God and connect people with God. But this church was not formed and it was not sustained by people who laid around and just thought about things. This valley was not settled by people who just laid around and waited for someone else to do the work. This church, this valley, our heritage is of those who were willing to get involved and work whether things were easy or things were difficult, working together for the glory of God. Paul wrote to the Ephesian church in Ephesians 5, "Be very careful how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil." Every generation has faced evil days. Every generation since the founding of the church has faced challenges. We don't wait for the skies to clear. Even in the midst of the storm, we do our work. We make the most of every opportunity. As a church, we have opportunity. As individuals, you have opportunity. Every one of you, in whatever age of stage of life you're at, whatever your spiritual gifting, God is giving you opportunities every day to bring glory to Him. The question is, are you going to be the one who responds? Are you using your life as one who might shine like stars in the midst of a dark generation? Another way of putting it is, we are like lighthouses in the midst of darkness. That there is hope in the midst of darkness, not because we as individuals have anything to offer, but because we point people to Jesus Christ, just as the church has been doing for over 2,000 years. One thing we know about some of those people in all the pictures that we've seen is that their time on this earth is done. They have finished the race. They have kept the faith, and now they have gone on to their reward. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses for us to run our own race, each of us being faithful to the race that has been laid out for us. Today, it's appropriate that we honor the past and provide for the future, but most of all, that we serve in the present, that we are stirred up and working and active and busy. God is not done with this world yet. Jesus is not done growing His church. There are still people who are in need of ministering, physical needs and spiritual needs, and Jesus would say to us, "I am still working to change the world. Will you join me? Will you shine like stars in the midst of a dark world?" I'd like to ask you to stand, and we're going to sing a closing song. We're going to think about what that means. Lord, I will follow.